All right, let's run through the second major element of topic 4, which is the idea of distinctive U.S. manufacturing in the 19th century. So the point here is that the United States developed a distinctive form of manufacturing in contrast to, you say, in contrast to England, where the Industrial Revolution had started already. So the simple points to highlight. Point number 1, U.S. manufacturing is resource related. Think cotton goods, lumber, boots and shoes, flour and meal, men's clothing, iron. Machinery is the only good in this list of top goods that is not heavily dependent upon resources, natural resources for inputs. This you can connect back to both the transportation revolution and land policy, because the Hamilton-Jefferson debate sees westward expansion as simply an increase in the land base of the economy. But there's a broader set of natural resources that are expanded by territorial expansion and brought into use by the transportation revolution. Notice here it says resource related. This should say natural resource related, because resources generally means L, K, and T. When we jump ahead to 1910, then machinery is the top manufacturing sector. Printing and publishing is less obviously connected to resources. You say, but Jim, paper. Yeah, but the paper is probably coming from Canada. Iron and steel, yeah, it uses iron ores and it uses coal for fuel, but still it's highly capital intensive, major factories with lots of people working there too, so it's not so resource related. Similarly, beer, yeah, you've got some malt and barley inputs, but again, by the close of the century, we're talking less of a natural resource based sort of manufacturing. All right. The second point to be familiar with is the idea that the input methods in the United States were quite different from those in England. In short, in the U.S., we replaced the skilled labor found in Europe, and instead we used more capital, more tools and equipment, that is, in order to be able to have unskilled labor and to take advantage of abundant raw materials. So the point first is the notion that craft production was replaced by mass production. You think of mass production perhaps with Henry Ford and the Model T, but that's much later. No, we're talking about simpler forms of mass production with relatively unskilled labor in small scale settings that we'll discuss more later on. One of the key innovations was called interchangeable parts. A lot of discussion for comparing and contrasting U.S. to British manufacturing focuses on guns, firearms, because instead of custom-made weapons as in England, there were mass-produced guns with parts that were interchangeable. In the U.S., each part would be made for a specific gun, and this in part was because it was targeted to a much more affluent, a richer audience. So early assembly lines, women and kids playing a much bigger role tending the machines compared to in England, although I think that's overstated because England was famous for abusing child labor. In any case, later on, it was immigrants who were providing cheap, unskilled labor for the textile mills. The Irish and my friends from Quebec were important sources of fairly unskilled labor for the early Industrial Revolution. The other point that's interesting to think about is the idea that when the British looked at American manufacturing, they said, you guys are wasteful. You're wasting raw materials. So, for example, our high-pressure steam engines burned way more coal compared to the lower-pressure steam engines used in England. Our sawmills had thick blades that lasted longer and didn't need to be sharpened as much, but wasted wood. And similarly, our textile mills were viewed as wasteful of cotton compared to the mills in Europe. And the Europeans thought it was wasteful, but that's because for them, the natural resources and raw materials were comparatively expensive, and it was the labor and capital that was comparatively cheap. In the contrast, in the U.S., the materials were cheap, and labor, especially skilled labor, was expensive. So it's a question of not wasting labor, and to some extent, perhaps not wasting capital. So, ideas of waste. What's wasteful or not? Think about that. What's wasteful really depends upon prices. It's not really wasteful if you use a lot of stuff that's not very valuable. Okay, finally, the other really important point to think about is the nature of the final products. Final products from American manufacturing were simpler and lower priced, designed for a mass market, whether it's clothes or guns or tools for the farm. The interesting debate here is the extent to which we are talking about low cost and good value products, or whether we're talking about cheap stuff that's frankly kind of crappy. I've heard stories that Walmart has lower quality goods than other stores. Famously, supposedly, Levi Strauss introduced a low quality version of Levi's jeans in order to meet the low price standards at Walmart. So lurking in the background is debates between snobs who say that low-cost stuff is crap, and on the other hand, people who want to defend against shoddy workmanship and just crappy material. So something we're not going to be able to solve, but an issue to be alert to. To what extent do low prices reflect low cost and therefore good value? Or do low prices reflect low quality, in which case, when something is cheap, it's cheap in the sense of being not good value, as well as being low price. Anyhow, that's the output angle. One other point. Water power was the key source of power for the early American factories. This is important because it influences location. The Northeast has much more of the sorts of small streams that are good for powering mills compared to the South. The South had more navigable rivers. It didn't to bring things to market, but supposedly they weren't quite as well suited to powering mills. The key point for you to know is simply that we're not talking about steam power. We're not talking about big factories yet. Indeed, the fact that it's not steam power is related to the point that we're talking mostly about small-scale factories. If there is powered machinery, it's water power. Steam power and the very big factories that you might have in mind in terms of the Rust Belt and the old great factories of the Midwest. That's something that comes after the Civil War. The one exception, the large scale of manufacturing would be flour mills got to be quite big throughout the country. But we can leave that in the background because we're talking about water powered. Now, the final point to note in terms of the distinctiveness of U.S. manufacturing is with reference to the small scale. We've got Ken Sokoloff's PhD thesis. In this PhD thesis, Sokoloff argues that the transition from craftsmen in shops to small-scale factories increased productivity. So it might sound like kind of boring detail to you, but the point is that for a long time, economists and policymakers were thinking that you needed to have factories with hundreds of people in them to get modern productivity and to get economic growth. Sokoloff's PhD thesis argued that simply going from 2 or 3 people working in a shop to a factory with 5 or 7 or 8 people with more of a division of labor, a little bit more tools, that was critical to the onset of the Industrial Revolution and the beginnings of modern economic growth and productivity change in the early 19th century. Now, in case you're interested, there are 2 debates here. The first debate is, was Sokoloff right that there really was greater production per worker, greater productivity in the small-scale factories compared to the small shops, the smaller-scale production? And the deal here is that when Sokoloff was estimating labor forces for the different sizes of establishments, he assumed that the owner-operator was not being counted among the workers reported on the census forms. So let's see that. And so what he did was he added 1 to all the estimated, to all the reported numbers of workers reported on census forms. So let's look at what that implies. Suppose the truth is that there's an owner and a worker in a shop and they produce 40 suits. And then suppose that down the road there's a little factory with an owner and 3 workers. So there's 2 workers producing 40, that's 20 per worker. And if there's an owner and 3 workers, 20 per worker, 80 suits. Okay, so notice the productivity here. Okay, so the question is, what happens if we follow Sokoloff and add a worker in each of those scenarios? What will we find as the measured productivity? Well, let's go ahead. We're going to say instead of owner and worker, we're going to add 1. We're going to have 3 workers, and we're going to have 5 workers and 40 suits and 80. So let's figure out productivity. Oops. All right, so notice Sokoloff's approach is going to say that the smaller shop had 40 suits being produced by a total of 3 workers for a productivity of 13 suits, 13.33, 13 and a third suits per worker. And his technique is going to say 80 suits are being produced by 5 workers, 4 plus 1. That's going to give him 16 suits per worker. Notice that 16 over 13.333 is about 20%. So Sokoloff is finding that there is a 20% greater productivity on the larger than in the smaller establishment. Okay, so we get the punchline that in Sokoloff's story, the labor force increased from 3 to 5 and productivity increased by 20% as a result. On the other hand, the critics say, no, Sokoloff, you're making that up. That's silly. There's no reason to believe that the census didn't count the owners who were workers, the people who were hiring in help into their little factories. And if they were properly counted, then we are just talking about the 20 suits per worker the whole time. With the Sokoloff approach, adding in 1 everywhere, eventually, once the factory's big enough, then you're going to get up to the 20 suits per worker because adding 1 more worker doesn't make any difference here or there to the calculation. Anyhow, more research is needed to pin down whether Sokoloff's got a valid result that there was increasing productivity by increasing the scale of production. Excuse me. The other point of interest is that Sokoloff is arguing that by having small-scale factories, there was less wasted time in the factories and more coordination of activities, and people simply working harder, which would have meant a less relaxed workplace. That's something that's kind of fun to think about because sometimes getting greater output per worker is really coming about from getting a greater work from a worker. Good for the boss, bad for the worker. So you want to think about the welfare implications for the workers of what it meant to be moved from the small-scale shop where a journeyman was learning the craft with the artisan or the master of the shop, as he would be called, and whether moving from that situation to a small-scale factory where you're one of 10 or 12 people in an assembly line sort of situation, whether that might have been a bit of a bummer for the workers. Final point to note regarding the scale issue. Keep in mind that it's only after the Civil War that you get the very large factories that for which America became famous. Large-scale factories powered by steam, and associated with that was the rise of big business. Might have been a fun topic to pursue if we'd had continued meetings and been able to pursue the regular course of activities. As it is, I'll just point out to you that there were a series of different merger waves. I think about 5 of them total over the past century and a half. The first most famous one from 1895 to 1904, when 1,800 manufacturing firms combined with their rivals. The point here simply is, if you want, I've put up on the webpage some stuff to look at there. The fun issue to think about is the extent to which mergers were based on increased efficiency, getting together reduced costs, and that's why they merged, or whether it's simply a question of two companies merging so they're not competing with each other, creating a monopoly. Now, that's fun economics. If you want to cover that, I recommend you take either Economics 410 or Economics 425. Those are government, business, and industrial organization, respectively. All right, that's our quick overview. I will be providing some sort of testing fill-in-the-blank materials to guide you through this material and hope when it's all said and done that you can kind of make some sense of this. One more video coming up on the north-south contrast to get us a transition to the slavery topic. Probably that'll be coming in a day or two.